folks, welcome to part 2 of this video. This is Cubase Pro 9. I'll be touching base with the interface a little bit just to help you navigate your way through. So over here we've got the workspace where your data will appear when you record, the rulers up here with your musical bars and your cursor. And here we have the track panel. When you add a track, it will appear here. And over here on the extreme left we have the inspector panel, which will house your track settings. When you select a track, the corresponding settings for that track will appear here. And above we have some configurations, editing tools, which I won't cover too much of this time. And we also have the layout control over here. This used to be on the top left corner in Cubase 8.5, but now in Cubase 9 they've moved it to the right. And they've added a few more buttons. Before it was just this window. Now they've added these few buttons over here to control your zones. This being the left zone, which is your inspector panel, and the right zone, which is your VST instruments and media bay panel. And they've also included an all-new lower zone. In this lower zone you have access to other windows which previously would be floating, and now they're housed in the interface itself. You have access to your mix console, and then with other tabs you can access your sample editor, sample control, chord pads, and also your key editor when you're working with MIDI. So right now I don't need the lower zone or the right. This is clean. Something else new that they've added is they've locked the transport panel on the bottom of the entire interface. Previously, to access the transport panel, you'd have to press the function 2 button, which will open up a floating panel. This being a floating panel, it could get in the way of your view in the interface, so you'd have to move it around or simply turn it off. So this is really handy to have it locked at the bottom, so everything is in view but not in the way. Moving on to setting up your device, I have my UR22 connected to my computer, latest drivers installed, software is running. I'm going to start setting up my device. To do that, I'll go to the Devices menu, then go to Device Setup. This will open a new window. In this window I want to select the VST audio system over here, and then I'll see a drop menu on the right. This menu will show me the sound cards available for my selection. First I have built-in audio, which is my built-in sound card. And over here I have the Steinberg UR22, which is what I'm using now, and that's already selected. That's good. However, do take note that in Windows, this will not show up as UR22. It will show up as Yamaha Steinberg USB driver. But on Mac, it will show you the model number, in this case the UR22. If you're using a UR44, it'll show up as UR44. Right, so I've selected UR22. That's done. Cubase is now using the UR22. It is using the inputs and outputs of that device. Next, I need to set up the routing of the audio interface. So typically audio interfaces have multiple inputs and outputs. So those inputs and outputs need to be routed. I like to call this virtual routing. So again, I need to go to Devices, and instead of going to Device Setup, I'm going to go to VST Connections. This again will open up a new window which show multiple tabs, but we'll only pay attention to the inputs and outputs tabs. Now if you're using a free version of Cubase like Cubase LE or AI, you will only see the inputs and outputs tabs. So I'll first go to the inputs tabs. So over here by default it shows you a stereo input comprising a left and right mono. So stereo means 2, mono means 1. I typically don't like to use this because I record mainly mono instruments like a microphone or a guitar which only use one input. So I like to remove this stereo by right clicking on it and click on Remove Bus Stereo. Then I start on a clean slate. So then I'll proceed to adding a few mono inputs by clicking on the Add Bus button. Make sure mono is selected. So the UR22 only has 2 inputs, therefore I will select 2 counts. If you're using an audio interface like the UR44, which is 6, then you may add 6. But in this case, I shall only add 2, and then I'll give it a name. Now this is just a naming convention. You can name it whatever you want. In this case, I will just call it input. And when you add the bus, it will add the inputs in chronological order. It will number it for you, input 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So I'm going to add the bus, and you'll see inputs 1 and input 2. Now, one thing to take note of here is that this is just a naming convention that I've given it. What's important is you make sure that the ports are properly assigned. So here I see Steinberg UR22 input L and input R. This should be named as UR22 1 and 2, not L and R, which is left and right. I think this particular device has got a little bit of a naming glitch. My personal unit of the UR22 names it as 1 and 2 for the inputs and left and right for the outputs. That should be correct. However, it's not a problem, it's just a naming glitch. It still works perfectly fine. So input 1 should correspond with your first input, input 2 should correspond with your second input, and so forth. So if it shows not connected, it won't work. No doubt you have input 1 over here, but like I said, that's just a naming convention. The port has to be assigned correctly. Okay, so I've got the ports assigned accordingly. That's done. Next, I'd like to save my presets. To do that, you click on the store button over here, indicated by a plus sign. Minus is to remove the preset. So I'd like to store a preset by clicking on this button, and I'll call it Steinberg UR22. Okay, so the reason for this is because for whatever reason, if you restart Cubase and it reverts to the default, which is stereo, you don't want to have to go through the entire process of setting up your routing again. So when you have a preset already saved, all you have to do is click on this drop menu over here. As you can see, I've got a whole bunch of presets. The one I've just created is the Steinberg UR22. Click that and immediately it loads the preset. If for whatever reason the port is not assigned and says not connected, go ahead and connect it accordingly. So that is setting up the routing for your inputs. Now on the outputs, it's straightforward. When Cubase detects your sound card, it automatically assigns the main outputs in the output tab. So you don't really have to do anything, but just check that it's correct. And as I mentioned earlier, this should be indicated as UR22 left and right, not 1 and 2. 1 and 2 should be on the input, so if this device has somehow inverted it, I'm not sure why. But again, not a problem, it still works. So I'm going to close this window. And that completes the setup process. On the next and final part of this video, I'll be showing you the recording process.